Good morning. The overall purpose of this presentation is to offer insights about how scientists can confidently and effectively operate in a policy and political world. Specifically, I will offer a few suggestions about how scientists can present policy relevant and scientifically accurate information to policymakers or to the general public for that matter. Okay, let's begin by considering a generic policy or political question and the various possible sources of information that are in play. For those folks like me who come from a strongly scientific tradition, it is often difficult to appreciate that there are other types of information that compete for dominance in the policy world. The fact is that what we typically call science is only one type of information. For sure, science is important in policy deliberations, but it is often not the most important type of information. This reality is often a real shock to early career scientists when they first observe it. In fact, often much in the policy debate often ends up being about which type of information will be used and how important are the various other types of information. As a political scientist might say, the most contentious question is often who gets a place at the policy table, which types of policy information counts, and who gets to decide. For those of us with a background in a science field, it is ever so easy to slip into the mindset that scientists determine, or perhaps should determine, which policy choice is best. Tempting perhaps, but not even in the ballpark of reality, at least not in a democracy. In fact, if you stride into the policy world with this viewpoint, you soon will be jolted back to reality. As a start, there are other types of information that the public and decision makers consider and typically use. Let's look briefly at two other common and important sources of information. Faith-based knowledge is information derived from applying an assumed value choice. Historically, faith-based knowledge was driven by religious theology. Most famously in the Renaissance, the classic example is the Christian theological influence on interpreting scientific facts about the origin of species. However, more recently, and in the scientific disciplines that most of us work in, the theology, comes from notions of environmentalism as religion. For example, there's nothing in science that says that a pristine swamp is better or worse than the same landscape converted to Disney World. To get a better or worse in science, you must implement a value judgment. There is no good or bad in science without a value criteria. I'll give an example shortly of so-called faith-based science. I want to emphasize that there is nothing inherently good or bad about faith-based knowledge. Similarly, in policymaking, there is nothing good or bad about science. But it is a very different type of knowledge than is faith-based knowledge. The third type of information is loosely called experiential knowledge. In short, such information is based on the experiences of individuals or groups of individuals. For those of you who have worked in fisheries policy or management, you will be very familiar with the knowledge that fishermen bring to the table. Often they and their families and communities have been fishing for generations and have accumulated a great store of knowledge. Any multi-generational family or group of people that has done something for a very long time does gather information. Yes, it was not obtained using the requirements of the scientific method, but it is a very common type of knowledge. And it is often critical to establishing the so-called facts about a management or policy case study. Let me elaborate a bit more about such knowledge. As the name implies, experiential knowledge is that gained through trial and error. Like some might call it real-world learning. Some scientists and policy advocates may not like the fact that experiential knowledge is even considered in policy debates, but regardless, based on my experiences, it is an important type of information. In fact, and I guess, and it's only conjecture on my part, It is the most important single source of information in policy debates. Okay, what exactly is it? This diagram might look complicated, but it reflects common sense and something that we all do intuitively to some degree. First, start at the purple arrow in the upper right. We all observe the world about us, and we all instinctively review, analyze, and evaluate our experiences and apply them to future tasks. Over many years, and perhaps even over many generations, the information gets further refined. Information that doesn't work gets thrown out, and new observations replace it. All pretty intuitive. This process might go on for generations. It might be written down, or it may be only passed on orally. After a time, a set of facts becomes generally accepted, and it will take quite a bit to change these beliefs. Experiential knowledge can be intertwined with faith-based knowledge, which I'll describe next. Faith-based information describes a vast swath of knowledge, but typically such knowledge starts with some spiritual or religious tenets or core beliefs. This is the outer band in this visual model. These beliefs are overlain on so-called ecological facts, the dark green band, to create a type of knowledge, an example of which is deep ecology. Now, these resulting facts have embedded policy preferences, such as the natural state of ecosystems is fundamentally superior to the same ecosystem altered by humans. Scientists would categorize such statements as assertions. The challenge in the policy and political world is that faith-based facts sound like scientific facts, but they are not. I will circle back to this challenge when I evaluate normative science. The third type of information I listed is captured under the label science. This type of information is much more constrained than the prior two types. It is acquired using well-established sets of procedures. Remember that earlier quote about which knowledge counts in policy debates. Many participants in policy debates will argue that science should be given a privileged position. That is, it should be considered as the best knowledge. Don't be surprised when some policy advocates push for this role for science, at least when they think that scientific information will help sell their policy preference. Remember, of course, policy advocates are free to use any marketing tactic that will help sell their preferred policy choice. Advocacy arguments aside, what exactly is science? Conversely, which information is not science? Let's briefly review the four essential characteristics of science. You heard all this way back in your first middle school science class, but it is worth revisiting these first principles at least once in a while. Francis Bacon popularized the key characteristics of science several hundred years ago, and these basic notions are still the foundation of modern science. First, observations must be rational, that is, based on a person's senses. Instruments are fine because they are extensions of the human senses. Second, information must be acquired systematically and in a way that is understood by others. Third, how the knowledge was acquired must be testable. Others must be able to duplicate the work. Fourth, and finally, reproducibility. Others, repeating the experiments or procedures, must come up with the same results. A few cautions. Remember, science is not value-free. The basic decision to use the scientific method, in contrast to the alternatives, is a value-based choice. As I have described, there are other ways to acquire knowledge. Now, most people expect that science will be policy neutral. That is, it will not be massaged to subtly support a particular policy preference. The third one is a personal preference of mine. The science that is being offered in policy debates ought to be relevant to the policy issue being described. Much of the science that gets discussed in policy debates is really only marginally relevant to the factors that actually drive policy conflict. More on this later. This all sounds simple enough, right? Well, here's your first test. Is this scientist operating as a policy neutral scientist, or is she operating as a policy advocate who also has an advanced degree in science? How would you tell? The fact is that it is often very difficult to identify when a person is an advocate masquerading as a scientist. Experienced policy advocates are often very adept at disguising their role. After all, in our fields, many advocates do possess degrees in science. Let's dig a bit deeper into this challenge. Here is a specific example. Just because a person has scientific credentials does not mean that that person is working as a scientist. After all, a number of folks in the U.S. Congress have degrees in science, but they are certainly not working as scientists. Most definitely, there is more to working as a scientist than just having a degree in science. Let's dig deeper. Imagine a scientist employed to assess the likely ecological effects of a proposed wind farm off the Oregon coast. Simple enough, right? However, that very night, there is a public hearing to obtain feedback from the local community about whether this wind farm should be permitted. And the same scientist is a featured speaker. The issue is contentious and the community is split. Here we have the same scientist speaking to the audience. Is that scientist a policy advocate masquerading as a policy neutral scientist? Or is he playing the science straight? Of course, if the scientist starts by making his role clear, it is easy for the audience. But what if he does not? It might sound like policy neutral science. How does the audience know? Advocates masquerading as scientists can be very effective in hiding their policy advocacy. At least this is what I have often observed many times. The practical problem for an audience or policymaker is that normative science looks, at least superficially, just like regular or traditional science. It also sounds just like regular science. Also, confusing to a non-expert, it is presented by people who may claim to be scientists. Regardless, policy preferences embedded in science are a corruption of science. Of course, advocates are under no obligation to be even-handed and impartial when presenting science, but scientists are. Normative science is not just sloppy science. It is what should be called faith-based science. The issue of Baconian science, or traditional science, becoming normative has been around for a long time. Charles Darwin's famous quote that a scientist should have a heart of stone fits perfectly. His view was that anyone using the scientific method should call the results fairly and impartially, not try to prove some predetermined policy preference, his heart of stone idea. Otherwise, such science is normative, that is, it has a built-in or assumed policy preference. Often, it is not easy to detect. Let's look at a specific example of how regular science becomes normative science. On the left, we have a stretch of ocean floor that is nearly devoid of fish. Given that a common public policy goal is to increase fishing opportunities, here the responsible agency official has decided to install a series of structures to increase fish numbers. The result is on the right. Sure enough, fish numbers increased. After all, artificial reefs have been used for this purpose for a long time. Okay, as a scientist, how would you present these facts in a way that avoids normative science? Remember, you are not the fisheries manager nor the politician, but the scientist tasked with assessing the ecological consequences of installing these reefs. You want to stick to policy-neutral science, but be helpful to the manager and politician. What words would you use in presenting your science? What about using the term degraded? Perhaps you might think that throwing a bunch of tires in a pristine section of the ocean is degrading the environment. So is the ecological condition on the right degraded? Or you might assume that an ecosystem, the one on the left, is in pretty poor condition because so few fish are found there. After all, fishermen love the new and improved ecosystem, the one on the right with the tires. So is the left one actually the degraded ecosystem? Either way, you have presupposed an assumption that one state of the ecosystem is better than the alternative. This is an embedded policy preference, normative science. Or perhaps the term healthy might be used in your scientific publication or presentation. But the same problem exists. What exactly in science will define whether the left ecosystem is better or worse than the altered ecosystem on the right? Similar to the word degraded, the word healthy needs a desired condition, and such a judgment does not come from the scientific method. Okay, what wording should a scientist use? Well, the obvious path out of this briar patch is to avoid using normative words. Certainly, these two ecosystem states are not the same. Most definitely, the one on the right is altered. Yes, it is different than the ecosystem on the left in significant ways. Whether those differences are important or not, whether those differences are good or bad, whether those differences are desirable or undesirable, all this is beyond the scope of science. So words like altered ought to be used in science. It is fine for advocates and policymakers to use whichever words they wish, including normative words, but it is not okay for scientists trying to present scientific information in a policy-neutral way. If you are a scientist who wants to be a policy advocate, great. Just be clear that you have stepped outside the bounds of science and are now pitching your or your employer's policy preference. There is nothing wrong with advocacy, but be transparent. To bury a policy preference in science is to practice stealth policy advocacy. It is stealth because the average reader, the average listener, will not detect the so-called scientist stepping outside the bounds of science. Okay, now what do you do when you get thrown into a nasty policy or political debate? To an early career scientist especially, it can be bewildering, but there are simple rules to follow that will help. Over my career, I've confronted many such challenges. The truth is that they are often highly stressful, and I've never found a way around this. But I did learn a few things along the way that will help. If you are operating as a policy advocate, the only criteria is, how is my approach helping to sell my personal or my employer's policy preferences? But if you are operating as a scientist, you should be asking yourself, am I sticking to the science fairly and impartially? Now, for scientists, the rules to help you survive in the policy world, be effective in conveying science, and help the public and policymakers make difficult choices. Rule 1, right from the top, play the science straight. No policy advocacy masquerading as science. Your physician doesn't tell you what to do. A good physician lays out your choices and the consequences of each. Risks and probabilities are included. All options are presented fairly and impartially. In short, you expect a physician to be even-handed. Scientists should do the same. Rule 2, guard against policy assumptions slipping into your science. Confirmation bias can be a real challenge. Don't assume that because the majority of scientists and the public think a certain way, that makes it true. Do your own due diligence. And remember Darwin's advice, develop that heart of stone. Rule 3, the job of a policymaker is difficult. Not infrequently, some of them would like to shift responsibility to some poor soul, like a naive scientist. Keep an eye open for this tactic. When a politician or policymaker asks you, a scientist, which choice should I make, don't fall for this ploy. You are providing political cover. Too often I've heard policymakers lament to the policy losers. This was a terrible choice. but the scientist told me I had to do it. Dr. X said I needed to follow the science, and I did. Always be helpful and explain the science, but don't fall for this common tactic used by policymakers to shift responsibility away from where it should be with the policymakers. Rule 4. How a policy issue is characterized or framed shapes the narrative of that policy debate. I've spent a lot of time working on salmon science and policy, but who says it is a salmon issue and not an affordable housing issue? After all, salmon advocates typically want more land to be left in an unaltered state. Housing advocates typically want such zoning restrictions reduced to allow for more and thus cheaper housing. Who is correct? Who gets to define a policy issue is crucial because how it is defined largely determines the nature of the policy debate. One thing for sure, scientists do not get to frame policy or political questions. Rule 5. As a scientist, avoid all forms of stealth policy advocacy. We have talked about this one quite a bit, but in science, watch out for words like degraded, improved, healthy, and so on. These kinds of words often mean that someone has made a choice about which state of the ecosystem is preferred. Such a choice, of course, is beyond the purview of the scientific method. Rule 6. Over time, policy priorities change. A few centuries ago, there was little debate about whether whales ought to be harvested, just like any other organism. These days, a sizable portion of the public would prefer that whales not be harvested at all, regardless of whether it can be done sustainably. There's nothing wrong with either policy preference, to harvest or not harvest, but they often do change over time. So, just because the science is well known, this does not lead to a particular policy choice as being the better one. Rule 7. I've learned over the years that policymakers have a difficult job, and I don't envy them. Essentially, what they do is pick the winners and losers by the always messy political process. One reason that ecological and natural resource policy issues are contentious is that some individuals and groups of people will lose with any of the many available policy choices. Policy making has some of the features of a zero-sum game. When someone says, let's look for the win-win option, what is really being said is, adopt my policy choice. If you think there are win-win options in policy, you have not looked deep enough to identify the losers. Let me wrap up with an example that is still playing out many decades after it was decided. Think back to the Pacific Northwest in 1948. There was a very large snowpack from the 1947-48 winter. When temperatures rose in May, the snowpack melted quickly, and there was widespread flooding. It wasn't the worst flood on record. That was in 1861. But that one was much worse. But there were many fewer people and much less development in the region in the mid-1800s. Anyway, in 1948, the second largest city in Oregon was Vanport, sitting right next to Portland, and it was completely flooded. And it was not the only part of the Pacific Northwest that was badly flooded. Of course, all politicians of the day wanted to do something to avoid future floods. But what to do? Well, the 48 flood was bad, and the nearly universal preference was to use dams to help manage control future floods. There already were some main stem dams on the Columbia, but they were mostly built for irrigation and power generation, and not primarily for flood control. So, the decision was quickly made to implement an aggressive dam building program throughout the Columbia River watershed and elsewhere as well. Plenty of scientific information was certainly available, and everyone involved knew that these dams would adversely affect wild salmon runs. But everyone also knew that the 1948 flood had devastated the entire Pacific Northwest, and those effects were really bad, and no one wanted to repeat. So, while there's always some debate around any scientific topic, in this particular case, the consequences to wild salmon were fundamentally known with high certainty. Thus, starting soon after the flood receded, and for the next 30 years, very large flood control dams were built on many rivers. What played out for wild salmon was pretty much what the politicians expected. Now, the question for you to think about was the choice to build these dams a good or a bad one? Fisheries scientists did their jobs and explained the likely consequences of each policy choice on salmon runs. And over the next 70 years, things pretty much played out much like the scientists predicted. There were no big surprises. Given the same policy issue today, would the same choice be made? For a scientist, especially for an early career scientist, working in the policy world can be exciting, but it also can be a traumatic experience. If this opportunity happens to you, I suggest that you tack my 7 rules to your office bulletin board, all the while remembering Darwin's advice to cultivate a heart of stone. Good luck.